Is Russia really about to collapse right now? Honestly, this would probably be one of the most terrifying things if it were to actually happen. Of course, is by the infographic show. Let's see what they have to say. I'm a little bit scared. I never know.
The Russian war machine is starting to crack, and what happens next could shake the entire world. At first glance, the idea of Ukraine defeating Russia might seem impossible, but the truth may just shock you. From a rapidly vanishing war chest to Ukrainian tactics that have disrupted Russia's core ability to wage war.
I've been watching this conflict very, very closely since the very beginning. I mean, I was here, on day one. Arguably, my channel weirdly was very successful because of it, because I wasn't really predicting it was going to happen. But at the same time, if you're watching closely, it was kind of obvious. Like for maybe 4 months beforehand, the Russians were moving troops closer to the border. They were getting all these things in play. They were clearly kind of working with Belarus to launch this invasion. Then all of a sudden it happens, and then bam, overnight the entire world is kind of locked into this subject. If you weren't locked in on geopolitics and the movement of militaries all around the world and all that stuff, then yeah, it came as a big surprise. But for anyone in this niche, or more than likely you watching this video right now, it actually wasn't a very, very big shock at the time.
This is the truth about just how close Russia is to losing, and why that outcome might be even more dangerous than if it had won.
That's kind of what I was saying in the very beginning. However, I have a lot to say about this. It's just, I will say, I think that we are coming closer to a peace deal. It sounds like we're coming closer to a peace deal than we've ever had in years. So that's something. That's something to look maybe forward to, maybe.
Currently, Russia continues to slow crawl across eastern Ukraine, so slow, in fact, that it would take over a century to reach Kyiv. But Russia will run out of power long before then. In late 2024 and into 2025, Russia was taking some of the highest casualties per day of the war so far. At the moment,
I believe there's an estimated already million people. There are estimates that said already million casualties on both sides, civilians included. Yeah, it's been absolutely horrific.
The fate of Ukraine rests on two factors: Western support for Ukraine and the Russian people's willingness to continue to tolerate truly apocalyptic levels of casualties.
It's so funny how often that has happened in history, where you kind of need, as the smaller power, just to destroy the spirit of the people you're fighting against. You need to try to find a way to get the people. Here's the thing, we're using the Russian example, but I'm really thinking of the American mindset and the American public. Look at how often America has fought wars, and the American public was just like, yo, what the hell are we doing? Whether it was with Afghanistan, or you can go back even further, 50 years ago in Vietnam. I mean, that's a big reason why we did lose Vietnam. It's just because the American public were like, hey, this is stupid. We don't want to do this anymore. A smaller power can beat a bigger power all the time if you can change the minds of the people that aren't even fighting in the war, in the bigger. Now, there's definitely something to say about the Russian people versus the American people. I believe the Russian people can probably stomach a lot more than Americans, and that comes down a lot to their geography and just who they are. And the Russians have just been through some shit. Let's be real. So the American public, I mean, you start to see, casualties roll in, and a lot of the American public was already going to be like, no, we don't want to do this anymore. Yeah, that is a nerf that we've definitely received. We have this massive geography buff because we get to set, we kind of get to stay inside of our own little island in between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. But the problem is we don't have the stomach to, well, not anymore at least. We don't, maybe things can change in the future, but at this current moment, we don't have the stomach to stomach some, mass casualties in conflict.
For the former, Ukraine got an unexpected shot in the arm when the current U.S. administration cut ties with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. The U.S. seems to have turned a corner, and the president recently announced a doubling down on support for Ukraine. New missile interceptors, even entire Patriot batteries, and more.
like the country balls here. This is interesting reference to country balls. I didn't know Infographics was doing this. And by the way, if you want some of your own country balls in plushie form, I am selling to Egypt, Botswana, and Somalia for the very first time. Egypt's obviously not a country ball. He's a country pyramid, but that's all good. So we have a whole African drop. If you want these, head over to makeshift.com. They will eventually be gone, and everyone gets sad. So use that link down below because I will not have any more to give out once these are gone and sold out. I'm pretty sure we will not see a cameo from these three countries in this video about Russia, Ukraine, the USA, and the West. However, Egypt is technically in BRICS now. BRICS expanded. The BRICS DLC expansion pack, maybe they could come up.
For Ukraine, new missile interceptors, even entire Patriot batteries, and more have been pledged, with the U.S. giving Putin 50 days to reassess the situation. This is galvanized.
I don't think this video is going to refer to the very recent meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Crazy place to have the meeting, considering Alaska used to be Russian territory, and all that stuff. And then obviously Trump met with European leaders, and then Trump met with Zelensky, and Zelensky wore a suit for the very first time, and for some reason that was just a massive news deal. I mean, maybe that's a symbol that things could be wrapping up. I don't really know, but that is extra context to this video.
Of Europe, where many expected the U.S. to walk away from the war. Now, with renewed American backing, hope is growing that Ukraine might actually defeat Russia. But that hope remains fragile, because even with fearing U.S. withdrawal, most European nations still refuse to make the hard sacrifices needed to ensure a Ukrainian victory. The entire
Love that we're still using country balls and they're firing firearms. That's crazy.
Their continent rests on a knife's edge and could teeter either way. Long ago, Putin mobilized the Russian.
There are certain European nations that for sure are taking it a lot more seriously than others. Basically, anyone that borders Russia, anyone that was formerly a part of the Russian Empire, anyone over there. So you're looking at Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, anyone that was close and that has had to deal with Russia historically. Nations like Spain, Portugal even, they probably have less interest on what's going on. I mean, there's literally a proximity effect. I just talked about how a lot of Americans, they're not thinking about this at all anymore. Probably the same with Canada. Now, there are exceptions if you have like a lot of, Russian immigrants in a certain community in America, or Ukrainian immigrants. There's certainly a lot of those as well. I'm thinking in like New York. New York, it's very different. But yeah, I live in LA, and I'm saying that proximity thing is a drastic difference. The other side of the country, even though America as a whole, I think doesn't, the general normie public doesn't really think much about the Ukrainian war much anymore. Still, the closer you get to it, even in the U.S., the more they think about it. Because again, this is a lot bigger a deal in New York than it is in L.A. No one really talks about this in L.A., sadly.
Economy for war, putting it in a position to threaten well past Ukraine in the near future. However, Russia is not without its challenges, especially as the U.S. ramps up sanctions on anyone it sees as aiding the Russian war effort. India and China, both big-time consumers of Russian oil, recently curbed their imports out of fear of secondary sanctions from the U.S. Yet vital.
Did India? I mean, I heard India's sanctions are going up because they don't give a frick. I mean, India at this point, they see themselves as the superpower that they've been memeing for a minute. I think that they definitely fully see themselves as superpower by, remember those memes from like 10 years ago? Superpower by 2030 or whatever. I think whether they are or not, they believe they are, and they are if they believe they are. You just kind of got to believe it. Think it, dream it, do it. That's all you really have. That's all you really got to do. And I mean, India's the number one most populated nation on earth. That is certainly a lot of bargaining chips that they have right there. So
technologies and materials for the war effort still make their way into Russia, mostly from Chinese and Indian sources. On the manpower front, Russia is reaching the end of any sort of easy recruitment to feed the voracious appetite for corpses that fuels the Russian war effort. For the first 3 years of the war, Russia relied heavily on shady recruitment tactics and a deep well of desperate volunteers.
And now they're relying on North Korea and other mercenaries.
Mostly drawn from the country's poorest, most disenfranchised communities.
Bro, there was apparently Americans that have gone over to Russia's side and helped them, which is crazy. I only heard about one that recently didn't make it, but there's no way it was just one. There's probably more.
In effect, Russia has conducted a legal ethnic cleansing, offering big pay packages to the poorest of Russians, often ethnic minorities. Russia
Especially in Siberia, they've been doing that for a minute, though. I mean, that's just old, classic Russian strats.
officials have been frequently accused of not delivering promised pay packages or of withholding them until the end of a successful enlistment, and then sending those fresh recruits straight to the deadliest parts of the front. When they die before completing their enlistment, their family is denied the enlistment bonus and pay package that had been promised upon enlistment.
What's fascinating about this, there's so much to say about this. I'm so excited to talk about this because there's so much to talk about and analyze. But Russia was already in a demographic collapse before the invasion. And now things are going to just be 10 times worse. I mean, Russia is one of the only countries on earth that has had more deaths than births. And a lot of it is due to the war. And they already had a severe lack of men in the country. Now, a lot of that is because of older men, because of the World War II time. I mean, if you look at their demographic pyramid, if you look at the top where the old people are, there's a drastic drop-off. First of all, there already is in most demographic pyramids, men tend to die earlier than women. But because we're talking about Russia, a whole generation was lost during World War II. And there's more than just that. During the Cold War, the invasion of Afghanistan, all the other messy situations the USSR have gotten themselves into. But yeah, overall, the Russians have always had kind of a demographic issue, and now it's just going to make this whole thing's just make it so much worse.
Just ask the family of American Derek Huffman, who recently moved to Russia hoping to gain citizenship. Huffman enlisted in the Russian military and quickly learned what that really means. A trained welder, he was promised that he would serve behind the front lines or work as a war correspondent. In just under 2 weeks, it was alleged that he had been sent to the front. Within the first month, it's been reported by some sources that Mr. Huffman was killed, something his family denies.
I didn't know we were going to talk about this in this video. Yeah, I have heard that. Of course, here's the thing. I mean, I don't know how true this story really is, but it sounds like it probably could be true. But the American media clearly ran wild with it when this story first dropped, which is not surprising. Of course, they were going to run wild with this, but
Russia's
I didn't look
enlistment
too much
blows
into
may
it.
prove
I don't know how real it is
to be its undoing. As with the pool of poor Russians, ethnic minorities, and even prisoners running shallow, it now comes time to recruit from the big cities. This is something Putin has avoided for years because he knows that families from metropolitan Russian cities will create far greater political troubles for him than poor families from the countryside.
Yeah.
It violates the social contract that the corrupt Putin regime established with the Russians from the onset. Its government is free to be as corrupt as it wants, as long as it doesn't mess with the people. Continuing a disastrous war may cost Putin the political support he needs to win it, placing victory within reach of Ukraine. But what if it does win?
Interesting desaturated Russian country ball. I almost didn't even know who we're looking at here.
Occupied regions liberated, Russian forces thrown back across the border in humiliated disgrace. What next? First and foremost, there is the political cost of a defeat, something Putin is unlikely to be able to bear. After years of propaganda and projecting a strong Russian state, the defeat in Ukraine would prove that its army is a paper tiger, one wholly unfit to face off against the threat it was designed to counter.
I think Putin would be in trouble if he didn't take any territory, but he's clearly going to get some additional oblasts, at the very, very least. And he'll probably be able to spin that enough to stay in charge. I think that if the Russian invasion was a complete disaster and they basically got no new territory, no new land, and I mean, I don't even know what the potential peace deal is going to look like. Maybe they get other advantages. Maybe they lighten the sanctions. Maybe there's less embargo on Russia. He's probably not going to take a political L here, more than likely.
NATO. From a military standpoint alone, this could prove lethal to Putin. Putin could find himself facing off against hordes of disenfranchised, angry soldiers, many of which are still waiting on promised benefits or pay packages, a repeat of the revolution that brought the communists to power in World War I.
I think one thing to get straight is that a lot of Russian people clearly support this and support what's going on, and he would not have been able to fuel this war machine for as long as he's been doing it. There's clearly a lot of Russians that are like, hell yeah. You know what? And it's hard to think of any other examples. A lot of this is probably, you could share the same mindset of the public that the Germans had after the defeat in World War I. The Russian people were this great power, this massive power during the USSR. I remember seeing polls from like 5 to 6 to 7 years ago where a lot of people just missed the Soviet Union. There was kind of a rosy, there was a rose-tinted glasses to it, and I don't think it was purely because of just they missed communism per se. I don't think they necessarily missed communism at all. I think they missed being that power in the world, on the world stage, because they were reduced so much in 1991 when they lost, the Soviet Union, when they lost all this territory, Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltics and Central Europe and Caucasus Mountain nations. So I think a lot of the people just want to go back to those times. They want to be respected in the eyes of the world by being this massive force, feared. So clearly the Russian people are stomaching this pretty fine. I mean, they've lost 500,000 people. I don't know what the pure casualties on just Russia's side is, but they've clearly lost a lot of people, and the people right now are supporting it.
We got a preview of what this could look like in 2023 when Wagner PMC's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin marched on Moscow with a small army of mercenaries. Despite only being a few hundred strong at its peak, Prigozhin's army repelled aerial attacks from the military as it moved along the highway to Moscow from the...
This could have been the biggest disaster of all. If this guy possibly, I don't know. It could have happened peacefully, but if another Russian civil war took place like it did during the Russian Revolution that caused the Soviet Union, that resulted in the Soviet Union, can you imagine that in 2025? Or this is 2023, but wow. That's what I'm saying at the very beginning. I'm like, this is scary to think of a massive civil war in Russia in 2025.
Ukrainian border. They even seized a major Russian city and drove out local military leaders.
That was a crazy time. I remember being glued to my Twitter, watching very closely to what was going on there because it looked like he might be successful.
Military personnel standing between Prigozhin and Moscow didn't just fail to stop his march, they actively allowed it, refusing to stand against Wagner. In the end, Prigozhin called the whole thing off, thanks to Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko brokering a deal.
And then they decided, oh yeah, is Lukashenko really tall? I forgot about that. And then they blew up his plane.
Prigozhin was assassinated months later with a bomb in his private plane. But such a march by veterans is something that Putin fears could still happen. With mounting discontent over not just the war, but failure to deliver promised benefits and pay, it could happen much sooner than Putin could predict. Russia's war chest.
I mean, this sounds... amazing from the Western perspective, but I just don't see it. I don't see it happening.
Its sovereign wealth fund is rapidly approaching the bottom of the barrel. Without access to its seized overseas assets, Russia has had to rely on its wealth funds to
You'd better make the most of it since it's been running out.
Finance the war and offset political unrest. It's estimated that Russia only has around $50 billion left in liquid assets, down from well over $110 billion in 2022. Within one more year, this fund will almost certainly be completely exhausted, putting the cost of the war entirely on the regular state budget, which is already running steep deficits.
They're going to have to break
Nations
the piggy bank.
can and do run deficits during wartime. The French economy continued resistance during World War I, even well beyond what it could technically afford. But facing the most sanctions of any country ever, Russia is already having trouble sourcing materials for advanced weapons.
Russian military machine on the brink of collapse. Sounds more like fake news to me. Remember, I just want to throw this out here. Remember that one of the greatest assets the Russian nation has is just the pure amount of resources they have. They're the biggest nation on earth, so they have access to so many raw minerals, material, resources. Obviously, they're the biggest country on earth, but they don't have the most population. They don't even have close to the most population. They only have a little bit over 100 million. But resources is the thing that really makes them powerful.
And then there's the question of how much the Russian people will tolerate in the name of a failing war of aggression. A military defeat is sure to fire up the Russian population, backed up by millions of combat veterans, many of which have disabilities or unresolved psychological trauma caused by the fighting. The Russian state would soon find itself deploying its military against its own people. And there's questions about just how many modern Russian soldiers would follow orders to act against their own people.
Again, like I said earlier, you have to assume at this time that the Russian people want this. They want... It's been going on for 4 years. I mean, they're clearly... It's hard to know what's going on behind Russia, because a lot of the people... Russia was kind of turned offline or whatever. They were kicked off YouTube, for example. Russia, was, for example. And then a lot of other... they don't have McDonald's there anymore. But it's kind of BS. I mean, just like in China, a lot of the Russian people just use VPNs, and they're still obviously on YouTube and all over the internet, basically. But I just think that there'd have to be something, and we're probably not even going to hear about it because it's hard to know what goes on in Russia nowadays. It's hard to know what goes on ground level with the people. But there's got to be a big subset of people that are clearly ready to go. And this is just a sacrifice they have to make if it means losing a son or a brother or whatever to restore the glory of Russia. That's probably what they're thinking. And it's interesting because you would think that's a lot more fragile of a mindset than what the Ukrainians are fighting for. The Ukrainians are literally fighting for independence, for sovereignty, for their home. So if a spirit is going to break it, I agree that it would definitely be the Russian side of things, I would assume, because the Ukrainians are like the Vietnamese in Vietnam War. They're out here just fighting for their country, for instance, or obviously another good example is like the American Revolution, just the Americans fighting for their own home.
Most of them were civilians not too long ago and are still missing promised pay packages and other benefits. All it would take is one charismatic individual to exploit the situation, and Putin would find himself facing a homegrown army intent on his replacement. But others within Putin's circle might calculate that after losing in Ukraine, Putin is at last vulnerable.
He'd have to piss off the oligarchs in Russia, like the major rich people. I'm thinking some oil barons and things like that. He'd have to really piss off those people first. I don't think just the Russian people alone can rise up and take out all of this. He's going to have to make his inner circle mad and want to, replace him with somebody else.
Like any dictator, Putin.
And I don't think there's going to be able to. Who's going to be able to take over Russia? It's just these personalities have become so iconic. Not to say it's impossible, but look at Xi from China, Xi Jinping. Like he's essentially just in charge now permanently.
Maintains control by carefully cultivating his inner circle and pitting them against each other. If they're too busy hating each other, they can't join forces in shared hatred of Putin himself. A defeat, though, could expose just how weak Putin has become and prompt those sitting on the sidelines to act. We know that Putin fears the power of the Russian oligarchs, given how he has taken extreme measures to keep them in check and intimidated.
Oh, yeah.
Numerous oligarchs and other prominent social figures have met their end via a fall from a high window, clear murders orchestrated by Putin himself. This intimidation tactic has so far worked. But with oligarchs watching more and more
of Putin will eliminate whoever he has to eliminate. I'm 100% sure of that.
Their wealth disappear by the year. It's a question of how long before they throw their support behind a successor to Putin, and their money could buy a whole lot of loyalty from disenfranchised Russians. But Putin has another enemy to fear, one he cultivated himself. Vladimir Putin has always leaned heavily on his state security apparatus, Russian law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It was his use of Russian intelligence agents to launch several false flag bombings of Russian apartment blocks that led to his cementing his grip on power. The fake terror attacks blamed on Chechen terrorists catapulted at the time a relatively unknown prime minister to the national spotlight. The war that followed may have been disastrous for Russia, but it served Putin's purpose of rallying the Russian people behind him. From then on, he has used the state security apparatus to keep tabs on dissidents within Russia, and especially amongst the people who really matter in Russia, the elite. On his order, dozens of dissenting elites have found themselves thrown out of a window, courtesy of Russian secret agents, all reporting
using that Czechia strategy from back in the day, I see.
To Putin. The intelligence and law enforcement have been strengthened so much, it's likely a challenger to a weakened Putin would arrive.
Why are there so many naked Putins? I did not sign up for this. I was not looking to see more naked Putins here.
As from within federal law enforcement, or more likely the FSB itself. Senior military leaders could also make a successful bid for power, backed up by an army of disenfranchised Russian conscripts bloodied on the front lines of the Ukraine war. Whatever the avenue of his demise, Putin faces many internal threats, which is why he rewards loyalty so richly despite obvious incompetence. Former Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, through his incompetence and corruption, has done much more to help the Ukrainian cause than most Western aid. And yet, when he was eventually replaced, he was simply shuffled to another senior position within Putin's government, rather than ousted the way his incompetence demanded. This weakens the Russian government overall, but it keeps those loyal to Putin close, and thus potential threats at bay. And then there's the nationalists, hardliners who even now grow increasingly bold in their protest of how the Kremlin is handling the war. These are the same people.
I could see that. There could be, especially, let's say there does become maybe a peace deal, or there's definitely it's definitely being discussed. It seems like it's probably being discussed more than ever in the Kremlin, but there probably is Russian nationalists that are like, no, let's not stop this. Let's keep it going. And if there's a peace, they could get pissed off. I could definitely see that. And then they want to get rid of Putin to keep the war going on. Actually, if that were to happen, that would happen right now. If it looks like, Putin is leaning towards peace and he's going to do peace, and the people, the powerful people that want to continue the war, more in Russia, if there's enough of them, then they might try something. Then I could see them definitely trying something.
People who have called for open use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and who have cheered on massacres of Ukrainian civilians and POWs alike. They have served as Putin's base of support for propagating the war. But as the incompetence of the Russian military is laid bare and casualties mount to astronomical levels, even their patience wears thin.
The question is how many of these Russian nationalists are still out there? Like, yeah, no, let's keep going. I'm sure they are. I'm sure they're definitely there. But how many? If it's only like 10% of the inner circle, 10% of the oligarchs, that's probably not enough. It's been like 4 years and it's been pretty bloody and they've had to make a lot of sacrifices. Like, is 40%, maybe about 40% of the Russian inner circle down to keep the war going? Maybe, maybe not.
An all-out
Those are high
defeat would
numbers.
enrage the hardline nationalists who could quickly turn on Putin and his regime, once more backed up by hordes of angry former and even active duty soldiers. These hardliners could pose a threat outside of Russia as well. Seizing local nuclear weapon stockpiles, hardliners might seek a form of revenge against Ukraine, maybe even the West. Leaders within the nationalist movement could gamble that a nuclear attack on Ukraine's eastern cities, ones currently held or claimed by Russia, may not be enough to provoke a serious Western reaction. Or perhaps they would gamble that, much like conventional conflict, the West would blanch at the thought of punishing Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Within this line of reasoning, punitive attacks against non-nuclear Eastern NATO members like Poland or one of the Baltic states could take place. NATO would face an impossible decision.
All this stuff, I mean, it's possible, but something to keep in mind is like, bro, we went through 50 years of the Cold War and no nukes were dropped. Imagine if this is when we drop a nuke. This is when Russia decides to drop a nuke, or the West. I think it's unlikely. The height of the Cold War, it just seemed like tensions were far, far higher. I mean, unless you're looking at like Russian sovereignty being threatened, which it definitely is not, then I think they're not going to be this stupid. You never know, but I would put money on them not being this stupid. Obviously, the word nukes have been thrown around a lot in the last 4 years, but I don't think that necessarily they're that dumb. They would, again, you'd have to put the entire like current regime in charge of Russia right now like on the ropes, and they would have to be threatened that Russia would, Russia's like everything about Russia is going to end. Maybe then they would throw the nukes up, because then they wouldn't care, because they're like, well, we're going to get nuked back. It doesn't matter. We're going to die. But as long as Russia is still a state and it's stable enough, they probably won't do something this idiotic unless they were put into a much worse position.
Retaliate with nuclear weapons against an attack not officially ordered by the Russian government, or risk appearing weak. Either choice could spiral the conflict completely out of control. Many nationalists today know just how reluctant the West would be to face this scenario, and they are in fact counting on it as a justification to use nuclear weapons. The world may...
So they would nuke, and they just think that we're too scared to launch our own nukes. Definitely possible. Definitely possible.
Cheer the collapse of the Putin regime, only to be horrified by what elements within Russia use that chaos to perpetuate against the countries that they would blame for Russia's defeat. Russia is a nation that's held together by strong centralized control, with many regions, especially in the South and Far East, having some level of independence movements. Muslim-majority regions have traditionally caused Moscow the most problems. But in the Far East, Russia is quietly losing a demographic war to its so-called ally, China. Chinese investment vastly outpaces Russian spending in the region, and rising immigration threatens to make ethnic Russians a minority on their own soil. With a weakened central government...
in Outer Manchuria, Outer Manchuria has tons of Chinese population, and I'm not surprised that there's tons of Chinese investment being flooded on in. And again, that is why don't be mistaken that Russia and China are buddy-buddy, and they're both going to die together, and they're this like perfect alliance that will never get broken. No. Russia definitely looks at China as somewhat of a threat. Even though on the surface, they want to work with China, but China is definitely somewhat of a threat to Russia.
Due to a loss in Ukraine, regions could see various independence movements spring up simultaneously. Terrorism would increase dramatically almost overnight, especially against cosmopolitan and ethnic majority Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in the Far East, an even greater threat looms: the potential loss of vast territory to China. China has made it clear for years now that it wants back territory ceded by its old imperial government to the Russian czars.
Oh, man. I don't think China's going to do this, but that is fun. Like, if China wanted to do that, that would be insane. Like, China has been able to do this. China was able to do this before the war even started, before the Russian invasion even occurred. They probably will not do this, but it'd be very fascinating for whatever reason if there were like some super hyper rare earth material that China absolutely needed to survive, and it was only in this part of Russian Siberia. They probably would do it, and they would take that stuff over in an instant. You're talking a billion Chinese troops. Well, they're not a billion. Their standing army is apparently like 2 million. I'm talking about their population as a whole. You know, there's 1.4 billion Chinese people apparently. But yeah, if they wanted to walk straight into this part of Russia, they could do it. And they probably would. And they could take this over. I just don't think they would do that. Why would they threaten? China has a lot to worry about. Why piss off one of their neighbors that doesn't despise them deeply? There's already so many other neighbors that despise China deeply. Vietnam, the Philippines, India. There's more than just that. This is one of their only allies kind of in their corner, so I don't see them doing this.
Today, the territories are rich in natural
But it is funny to think about because China could probably, especially right now while Russia's bogged down in Ukraine, if China wanted to take all this, they could so do it. I mean, as long as they have the logistics, that would be the biggest thing because it's a cold region over here. It is very cold. They would need the logistics.
Resources such as oil and gas, prices that Beijing has its eyes on. With most of its oil imports coming from the Middle East across oceans it can't defend, China is eager to shore up this strategic vulnerability. Already, official Chinese map makers have begun printing maps with the old Chinese names for these Russian territories.
That's really funny. That is so funny. I'm just not buying this at all. Maybe in like 20 years, the current like layout of the geopolitical chess match that's going on, I don't see this happening. But maybe.
And the wave of immigration and investment into the Russian Far East hints strongly at an orchestrated plot rather than happenstance. In the wake of
Russia's definitely paranoid of becoming like a lesser power to China, just like kind of like a little buddy, basically becoming like a little North Korea, little broed to China, if you will.
Collapsed or weakened central government, China could pull a page out of Russia's playbook and claim that it needs to protect ethnic Chinese on Russian territory.
Oh, hell yeah. If Russia collapses into a civil war, China just rolls up in there and grabs all of it. Maybe they actually might stabilize it and put their own like kind of puppet government in charge. I could see them doing that.
Russian troops already weakened from years of fighting in Ukraine and likely lacking much conviction in a Moscow government would face off against modern, fully staffed mechanized Chinese forces. It's a proposition already so dire for Russia that as recently as the mid-2010s, it is trained to use nuclear weapons in the opening stages of a Chinese invasion. The conflict.
This is what I'm saying. Don't ever think that Russia and China are best friends for life. They were on the same side in the Cold War, and look how long that occurred for. I mean, that was only like for 25 years before they did their Sino-Soviet split. So
it could become nuclear, or it could be relatively bloodless with demoralized and outgunned Russian troops.
I don't think the Chinese like intentionally invade that stuff. I think they just have like special forces in Moscow try to prop up and stabilize the Russian government and just make sure they have like a puppet, like a Chinese puppet in charge of Russia from now on. That's probably what they would try to do.
Allowing the Chinese entry. That doesn't prevent a rogue Russian general from ordering the use of nuclear weapons anyway. With a weak central government, or perhaps none at all, there would be no real checks to his power to do so. Whatever the fate of the Russian government, its economy is certain to be destroyed in the wake of a loss to Ukraine. Putin himself has admitted that the economy is overheated and has called for less defense spending in 2026. The Russian central bank recently announced that it has run out of almost all reserve resources. Currently, the economy is being kept from crashing due to wartime mobilization, and
this stuff is important to remember because this could bring them to the negotiation table. Maybe that's why they are coming to the negotiation table, if this information is true.
Use of the National Wealth Fund. A wealth fund predicted to last no more than another year. With the end of the National Wealth Fund, Vladimir Putin would have overseen one of the fastest losses of national wealth in modern history. But even more importantly, he could no longer cushion both the military and the economy from the effects of sanctions and wartime mobilization. Pensions for retirees would disappear overnight, as would all matters of social services across the board. The large pay packages that the militaries relied on for recruitment and to keep civil unrest low would also disappear. This is actually a bigger problem than most people know. In a convenient bit of mental gymnastics, Russian society has found a way to do that which it has historically always done: avoid blaming the government for the rampant death of the population and pin it on the dead instead. But if that money runs out, there's no excuses to hide behind anymore. People are dying because the government is corrupt and incompetent. Even the incredibly casualty-tolerant Russian people, for whom life is historic.
That's a good way to put it. Incredibly casualty-tolerant. That is a very good way to describe the Russian people.
Cheap, would find that a hard pill to swallow. Mobilizing the Russian economy for wartime production has done much to stave off inevitable collapse. However, what Putin is actually doing is burning the candle at both ends. Wartime production can fuel an economy for years, but it's in effect cannibalizing itself to do so. Unlike consumer goods and services, wartime goods...
That's the thing. How do they switch their economy back to just, a civilian economy, not a wartime economy? Because right now, they're from what all the reports are saying, they're pumping on all cylinders. They're firing on all cylinders, this Russian war machine. How does it go back? And that's a great metaphor. Maybe the candle is being burnt at both ends, so it is firing on all cylinders right now, but when it stops, is it just over?
Produce zero economic value unless they're used for conquest. A tank once built will not earn a return on investment, only trigger even more spending on fuel, maintenance, and ammunition. The Russian economy may seem to be weathering international sanctions and the cost of the war in Ukraine, but it's an economy headed for disaster the moment the war stops. Without foreign investments and the lifting of sanctions...
What are they going to do with all this stuff? Just sell it? Can you imagine the massive, all this Russian military equipment that just put on the black market? Who are they going to sell it to? Iran? I mean, I don't think China needs it. Korea, North Korea maybe. They don't have that many buyers, more than likely, but...
The Russian economy cannot bear the cost of defeat or victory. Paradoxically, it must keep fighting in order to stave off total collapse. This is why, even during periods of more cordial relations, the U.S. offered Putin talks on lifting sanctions and negotiating new energy deals. The goal was to create a soft economic landing, Russia's only real hope of transitioning from war to peace.
Here's the thing. I don't think the U.S. wants a complete Russian collapse. Actually, I can almost guarantee the U.S. government does not want to see the Russians collapse into a civil war, because then we all possibly die. So I don't even think a lot of Europeans want to see a Russian civil war, because then the migration that occurs would probably collapse European governments, all the Russian people trying to flee from the violence. You want to hurt it as bad as possible, but you probably don't want to kill Russia entirely. You want to make it slow and somehow get rid of Putin, but you don't want it to completely fall apart, or else possibly everyone falls apart. That's what there's certain forces in the West, I'm sure, that are thinking about that.
Without disaster. And yet, not only has the U.S. seemingly done a 180 on Russia, but the rest of the world is extremely unlikely to simply forgive Russia for its many war crimes and wanton aggression.
That's going to be really difficult to do. That probably will not happen. The Europeans are going to hold this against them for a long time.
Europe, in particular, most threatened by Russia and even the victim of kinetic sabotage and murder by Russian intelligence, is unlikely to simply lift sanctions the moment the war ends.
I hope they don't. I hope Germany does not care about that Russian energy anymore. I know they're desperate. I know that they've been desperate, but Germany, you can't just go back to that Russian stuff anymore.
This means that the Russian economy is speeding straight at a looming brick wall, a disaster made worse if Russia loses and is forced by the international community to pay reparations to Ukraine. In fact, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Russia collapsing might be what forces the world to lift their sanctions anyway.
That's basically what I was getting at. You can't let Russia just die.
Neither fair nor just, but
you gotta poison it and let it collapse slowly from the inside, but make sure it's whatever comes out of it is stable.
If the choice is between keeping Russia intact and its nuclear arsenal under control, or risking civil war and atomic weapons falling into unknown hands, the world will likely do everything it can to prevent Moscow from falling.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly what I just said, yeah.
Alternatively, the end of the Ukraine war could trigger a new one if Moscow does in fact fall. With a catastrophic collapse of the Kremlin regime, NATO and even China may not have any other option but to invade Russian territory and carry out aggressive airstrikes, all targeting Russia's nuclear capabilities. Western special forces backed up by paratroopers and eventually even mechanized ground forces could launch incursions into Russia in order to seize nuclear facilities and stockpiles against both the Russian military and Russian separatists. If seizing them is not possible, they may opt instead to carry out large-scale airstrikes and destroy these facilities and stockpiles in place. The truth is, there are a myriad of possible futures for a Russia that's defeated in Ukraine, and most of them are a nightmare for the rest of the civilized world. History has never seen a nuclear power collapse, but Russia is well on its way to being the first, and the consequences could be disastrous for everyone, no matter where on Earth you live. The real winner.
I think that out of the 5 great powers that I always talk about on this channel, that is China, that's India, that's the USA, that's Europe, and then that's Russia. Russia is easily the weakest out of the 5 great powers. I don't think they're going to collapse. I think that they're more than likely going to figure it out. I think a lot of this stuff is wishful thinking and probably just trying to get people hyped so they click on the video. More than likely, I'm just going to be honest. But yeah, I would agree that if any of those 5 major powers could collapse, it probably would be them. Unfortunately, BRICS and Egypt did not come up in this video, but if you want BRICS and, well, if you want Egypt in your house, as well as Botswana and Somalia, you can head over to makeshift.com by using that first link in the description down below. These will eventually be gone, and I won't be able to sell them anymore, and it'll be a sad day. So, see ya. And a big thanks to my patrons this month. Drew's abandoned son from Alabama. Petition for Drew to make Hoi 4 ASMR Tingles version 2. Nolan. Alexander the Terrible. Nord Tyrol. Miglu the Goat. King Bear Hayes. Connor Pavlik. Frederick Tiblin. Carmel. Drew's Argentinian Trust Fund. Rip Grandpa. Douche Baggins. Luxembourg Lover. And Tambrin.